I'll cover 4 main points in the next 15 minutes. First, briefly, what we mean by a basic income grant for Namibia, and then an overview of the key social and economic benefits, and then how we can conceptualize the cost and some of the research that has been conducted on the cost. And then I want to focus on a key design feature of a basic income grant, which is its universalism. We can define a basic income grant as a universal cash transfer delivered without any conditions to all Namibians. It's a Namibian idea. It came out of the 2002 NAMTEC Commission, and it was tested in a pilot in Otjivero, as we heard about just a couple minutes ago. And it expands the productive and equitable delivery of a public tax benefit system. It is a program that integrates with Namibia's tax system in order to tackle the problems of poverty and deprivation, and active in the context of high inequality, because a relatively small slice of tax revenue can make an enormous difference for the majority of the population. And as we see from this data, the World Bank's classification as an upper middle income country, we've heard from the president a couple of years ago, puts the country at a disadvantage in terms of receiving development partner support, but it puts the country at a great advantage in being able to mobilize the necessary resources for effective social and economic policy. We've heard from the Office of the Presidency that the President has been a big supporter of the basic income grant for over a decade. Namibia has, as a country, made very effective use of cash transfers in terms of reducing poverty. And if the goal is to eradicate poverty, then one of the big questions revolves around the question of targeting. And what we saw a couple of years ago in the face of COVID-19 was a rapid expansion of cash transfer programs around the world and across Africa, so to the point where nearly every country on the continent had adopted a cash transfer program. And in fact, Namibia's program was one of the highly acclaimed models for the speed with which it was rolled out to tackle the problems of poverty. And what we have seen around the world have been a number of countries adopt more universal approaches, not necessarily, as Tuvalu in the Pacific did, a completely universal basic income grant, but certainly moving to adopt a high coverage cash transfer program as the way to tackle poverty, deprivation, and the shocks associated with COVID. But here in Namibia, as many of you I'm sure are aware, the pilot in Otjivero did demonstrate vitally important social impacts, first in reducing volumetric poverty, but also in strengthening a range of developmental impacts, including nutrition, where weight per age for children improved significantly. We saw significant increases in school attendance and school progression rates. The grant helped mobilize communities and supported empowerment. We saw reductions in crime rates and improvements in women's empowerment. And this contribution to building human capital is particularly important in the face of a pandemic, because technology is becoming increasingly important in generating wealth and enabling economies to grow in the 21st century. And so what we also saw, not only in addition to these improvements in social indicators, including human capital, was that people were also more engaged in economic activity. We saw the rate at which people engaged in economic activities increasing, indebtedness fell, savings investment increased. And one of the observations from a qualitative evaluation of the impact addresses a big question that many policymakers have about cash transfers broadly, including a basic income grant. Do they create dependency? And it's certainly the observation of one of the participants that a basic income grant contributes to development and initiative, not dependency. That's also evidence we saw in a quantitative evaluation in South Africa of households that received a child support grant. Workers in these households wanted to work more. They were out there actively searching for work more, and they found employment more successfully. Transfers or a basic income grant would create dependency. There's a lot of evidence that they help households manage risk and promote employment impacts. And if we go a few hours away by plane to Mauritius, we'll land in a country that a half a century ago had a poverty profile similar to the worst of African countries. Today, it has one of the lowest poverty rates on the continent and has experienced some of the highest growth rates in the world. It's Africa's economic miracle. And a World Bank, International Monetary Fund report from a few years ago asked the question, who can explain the Mauritian economic miracle? And the evidence from its social protection program was that it helped to share the benefits of economic growth and enabled the country to make the transition to an export-led high-growth path, and was one of the key factors responsible for its rapid economic growth. We've, of course, been dealing with COVID these past 2 years, but COVID is not the last crisis. It's not even the worst shock that social protection systems need to be able to deal with. And a basic income grant has been considered with its universal potential as an appropriate tool to deal with a shock, a universal shock that affects us all. And as governments face with the challenges of poverty and deprivation, having the flexibility of reaching the entire population with a single efficient and effective instrument is proving very appealing as governments work on their policy options. Basic income grant builds resilience to shocks. Initial estimates based on microsimulation modeling indicates that a basic income grant can halve poverty and cut extreme poverty by 2/3 or more. We've seen globally from universal responses to the pandemic that these more universal benefits offer the most effective remedies and also counter the negative effects on the economy from a recession. They provide very effective fiscal stimulus, and they provide a whole range of developmental impacts, including building human capital that can tackle the supply side requirements of an economy and ensure economic balance. I want to highlight a couple points about affordability. The cost of a basic income grant depends on a number of factors, including the benefit size, of course, and how the delivery of the program interacts with other grants. Do other grants become part of that basic income grant, or is this provided on top? But very importantly, it depends on the financing approach. The important cost that is of concern to policymakers is not the gross cost, but the net cost. Basic income grants, and in fact, any kind of cash transfer are typically financed through the tax system. And for many people in the tax system, it represents a tax rebate. And so it's important to net from the cost of the basic income grant the amount that is being recuperated from taxpayers, particularly the part that is coming right back to the fiscus through the taxpayers' own spending. Our research in previous modeling exercises have suggested that depending on the benefit size and the way it's financed, the net cost would range between 1 and 4% of gross domestic product of the basic income grant. As we look at Namibia's tax to gross domestic product ratio, compare it to comparable countries in Africa, to other regions, to OECD countries, Namibia's tax to GDP ratio is relatively low. I want to just highlight before I conclude a very important design feature. Should cash transfers be targeted, or should a universal basic income grant be provided to all Namibians? And there are a number of vital features of universalism. They define the basic income grant, and they're vitally important for the developmental impacts. First, universalism builds national solidarity and strengthens social cohesion. Targeting, no matter how we try, it is the design feature that keeps us awake at night. Many of the poorest are excluded, and targeting exercises can be expensive and wasteful. We produced a paper published in the Journal of Development Effectiveness, I'm happy to share, following up on a World Bank study more than a decade ago. Both studies found that the threshold of targeting error that defines the best programs in the world is about 40% exclusion when you try to target the poor. And that's because it is simply so challenging to put in place effective mechanisms for identifying and reaching the poor without excluding them. Basic income grant, a universal approach, is the best way to reach everyone. And in the face of a universal shock like COVID that affects us all, a universal grant is more important than ever. It minimizes the economic perverse incentives of targeting. It generates the greatest positive impact on employment and livelihoods. It helps build political support, which is vital for sustainability. Universalism means that it's an entitlement, so it can be delivered with dignity and strength and self-esteem. Keep in mind that even a universal grant ultimately is mainly paid for by higher income groups who pay for their own grants and everybody else's. But because it provides for this integrated benefit as part of a tax benefit system, it tends to improve tax morality. And so often we see finance ministers look to universal approaches in order to create a more efficient and more effective tax system. I want to conclude with a few key observations and hand this over to you for any questions. A basic income grant is the surest way for the government of Namibia to achieve its goal of eradicating poverty. And the social and economic returns to this are extraordinary. In particular, in terms of laying the foundation for building the cognitive and human capital that today is the foundation of the wealth of nations. The real cost, the net cost of the basic income grant is affordable for Namibia, particularly in light of the extraordinary economic returns. And universalism, delivering to every Namibian, is the key to the inclusive social development and the equitable economic growth that a basic income grant offers. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the research I've provided or any elements of the policy proposal you would like to interrogate.
Thank you, Professor, for that informative basic income grant. Okay, so the floor is open for questions. Anybody would like to ask Professor a question?
Are there other African countries and perhaps even European countries that have, sort of achieved their goal of eradicating poverty through the basic income grant?
Are there other examples of a basic income grant that countries have adopted, and what has been the experience of those?
Exactly. Yes.
Great.
Okay.
Great. Excellent. Yes, Mongolia implemented initially a universal child benefit that they delivered for many years, and about a decade ago, they scaled that up into a universal tax transfer, a basic income grant for everyone in Mongolia. They eventually scaled that back to a universal child benefit because of fiscal constraints in the country and an international crisis. And a lot of pressure from international organizations to target the universal program. But during the period in which they delivered it, it made a very substantial contribution to supporting the country's social development. A number of countries have piloted basic income. Tuvalu, a country in the Pacific, in response to COVID, announced and delivered a universal tax transfer. And a number of programs, a number of countries have implemented universal programs for children, including Bolivia and Nepal, and of course Mongolia as well.
Good afternoon. I'm Kanji from the MSc. I just have one question for Prof. And it is as follows. Prof, I just wanted to know, as per your observations and research on the basic income grant, non-implementation or ability thereof, is it necessarily a question of a lack of resources, or is it rather one of the lack of political will across the African continent? Now, the question is whether the non-implementation thereof of the basic income grant or the hostility thereto, whether it's a question of a lack of resources, a general lack of resources, or whether a lack of political will.
Thank you. That's a vitally important question, because resources ultimately depend on political will. Governments are able to pay for the programs that are the highest priority for them. And the tax effort analysis is an econometric analysis that estimates whether or not a country is hitting a real economic budget constraint, or whether it is simply the decision of key policymakers not to tap the resources that are potentially available through adjustments to the tax system. And that tax effort analysis demonstrates that Namibia could raise up to 3 or 4 percentage points of national income in additional taxes, without undermining its economic competitiveness. And hence, it is simply a matter of political will. Does the government want to raise the necessary revenue required to finance?
The founder of the local welfare organization called the David Kasume Community Development Organization. We work with the vulnerable and minority communities in this country. My concern is that with the introduction of the BIG, that the government just recently announced with the cabinet resolutions. What worries us is that of course, I do not want to pose this question to you, but in general, to the academic administration, whether they have a white paper or a policy document of this, what we call it, a concept paper, that is still to be seen. Maybe members of the journalists or media houses who are here, maybe they can help us to get access to that, to those information. The EIG is seen to be not discretionary. Of course, Namibia has a welfare grant for the heritage persons. Unfortunately, the new BIG to be introduced doesn't cater for the marginalized. More than 60% of our population, especially the young people. That is quite a cry, a marked cry, given that the young people are faced by now 53% unemployment rate with no hope for the future. That's all for my part. I hope I was quite clear. Thank you, Michael.
Unfortunately, I'm wondering if it's possible to bring the microphone closer to the people asking questions, because it's not coming through the connection very clearly. Or perhaps if Herbert or Inga, if you're near the computer, maybe just repeat the question.
Okay. Yes. Did you want us to repeat his comment? He was just saying that basically he was saying that it's the what the government is planning to do. The PIG that will only be targeting 45,000 Namibians, is excluding the largest group of our population, which is the youth, right? And it's just a comment that you made. Yeah, it's just something that you wanted to comment on. My question was, what exactly? I was thinking about the government is planning to implement this basic income grant. So, Professor, would you mind helping us understand what exactly that is? I mean, maybe clarify the characteristics of the basic income grant, because, and maybe explain to us what that is that the government is planning to implement, because it's not a basic income grant at all.
Just a moment or two.
Sure. Yes, certainly.
Before you respond, we know the dealing with government says you have always this way how to shut down questions. Ask whether there is a white paper or concept paper with regard to what our government just introduced. And of course, they were going to shut it down and say, no, there is already a pillar, what is a prosperity plan. please let us not be deflected to that. We want a white paper that is outlining the new EIG that we're talking about, the EIG.
So Kasumi is saying basically maybe everybody here, including the journalists, or maybe the journalists can help us get a concept paper regarding on what the government is planning to do. So more or less like that, yeah? Okay. Yes, I cannot imagine the importance of, such a paper being made public, but do we really have a chance of getting that paper public, made public by the Ministry of Gender and Poverty Eradication? Would you like to answer to that, or maybe just comment? It's not a question, but just to comment before I give you somebody else to answer a question.
Is that a question for me? Because
No, sorry. It was just a comment.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just a comment. I thought maybe that you would want to respond to that comment or add anything.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm struggling to hear the comments, and I'm wondering if it's possible to move back up closer to the person who's speaking, because it seems, I'm not sure if they're using a microphone, but it's not going into the computer input very well. But when you're close to the computer, I can hear the question fairly well, but from a distance, it's a little bit challenging. But I think I've heard the question about a white paper that the journalists have not been able to get access to, and I do not have access to it either, and I'm not sure if that is available. Perhaps that is the question.
Yes, and also what you think of what the government is planning to implement, converting the food bank into a basic income run, but from the look of things, that is not a basic income run. So what do you call that, Professor, what the government is planning to implement?
I mean, from what I understand, the government's proposal is to try to target very narrowly cash transfer. As we heard in the introductory remarks, the extent of poverty and vulnerability in Namibia is enormous. Over 1 million people, and targeted benefit that reaches a tiny fraction of that will not be adequate to deliver first on the goal of effect, and they have to make tough choices about what is important in terms of expenditure, but they also have opportunities to expand those budget constraints by making adjustments to tax rates, and those could be value-added taxes, those can be income taxes, which can include corporate or individual income taxes, they can include capital gains taxes. There are a whole range of tax mechanisms finance ministries have at their disposal. What we have seen all around the world have been countries expanding their resources in the face of a crisis, because what determines a country's taxable capacity in most cases are political, not economic factors. Yes, there reaches a point that when taxes get too high, that you begin to bear economic consequences, but the economic analysis for Namibia indicates that the country is not facing a tax cap. The government can adjust tax rates and increase tax revenue and distribute that tax revenue to the population in the same way it delivered the COVID social grants. And that will, as it did in the past 2 years, and as we've seen in so many countries, it will stimulate economic activity. It will give people economic security. It will help strengthen economically productive responses, investments in small businesses, social cohesion, human capital development, which will lay the foundation for future economic growth. It does require tough choices by government. It will take a number of months to put in place an appropriate financing mechanism, but the government has choices in how it can adjust tax rates to finance this basic income grant.
But given the Namibian situation of high amounts of inequality and a large amount of people in poverty, but with a relatively small population, what do you think that the optimum amount for a basic income grant should be to achieve the goal of eradicating poverty?
A question for social, economic, and political analysis. And that kind of analysis is not deterministic. There is no one single number. If we look at the size of the grant that was delivered in Otjivero in the pilot and adjust that for inflation, that would be about 208 Namibian dollars a month per person, and that's about a minimum that could be distributed and have a meaningful impact. A grant of 300 Namibian dollars to every Namibian is probably more developmental and more equitable than a larger grant, say 500 Namibian dollars delivered only to adults, because one of the big channels through which a basic income grant generates impact is by enabling children to get the resources that they need for their cognitive, physical, and social development. But the numbers that we've heard discussed in policy per person, these are affordable, and while they're not adequate for eradicating poverty, they represent very effective first steps in meeting the challenge. And keep in mind that they're the initial steps in contributing to productive activities and community development that can take the process further in eradicating poverty. So the amount that we've heard from the big coalition, for example, is affordable and will make a meaningful dent in the challenge of poverty that the country faces.
So just a comment that we have to remember that Namibia is in the top 10 when it comes to minerals and resources. So my comment is that why is it not possible? And you have to remember that politicians are not the right to promise people jobs. That is the public that has to do that. So with the basic income grant, this can assure that the 500, as you have seen from the pilot project in Otjivero, you have seen that a woman came up with a factory. So, which means this can create job opportunities. So imagine if this basic income grant could become a universal in Namibia. So, which means that young people will come up with businesses which will create employment at the end of the day, which will also reduce poverty in Namibia. So thank you.
Or, yeah, I think the first question I heard is, I think how will a basic income grant support economic activity, and how does it support businesses? And it does that in a number of ways. First, and most immediately, it puts money in the hands of people who drive economic activity. When people have money to spend, they can support the small businesses in their community. That's certainly what we saw in Otjivero. We saw people able to sustain micro enterprises in their community. There's a well-known bakery in Otjivero which saw significant increases and the stabilization of demand for food. And of course, if you give vulnerable households cash, the first thing we see them do is spend money on food. And particularly in Namibia, where agriculture is a very challenging activity, even in the north, where there's more agricultural activity, it is still a high-risk activity. And why should small-scale farmers invest in this if there's so much risk? And so what a cash transfer, what a basic income grant does, is it stabilizes purchasing power and enables small-scale businesses to invest because they can actually sustain their enterprise. And because these small business owners are also receiving the basic income grant, they can use it for working capital, they can use it to manage their own economic risks. And we see, for example, in South Africa, small-scale farmers who are receiving the child support grant are better able to handle the shocks to their livelihoods that otherwise would wipe them out. And in the long term, people take these resources and invest in making sure their children go to school and build the human capital that breaks intergenerational poverty traps. Basic income grants, cash transfers enable small entrepreneurs to be more successful. And this can tackle the problems of monopoly power. We've seen that the fiscal stimulus from these cash transfers tend to have positive effects, raising employment rates, both increasing the demand for labor and making it easier for people to more effectively supply themselves to the labor market. And so they're good for livelihoods, they're good for promoting decent work as well.
But countries that tend to increase their tax also create this effect where foreign direct investment is lost, because many of these foreign businesses or multinational companies will opt to invest in countries with much lower taxes. So right now, as we can see, our president is currently on a trip to Europe to secure some foreign direct investments for huge projects such as the green hydrogen project in the country. But just maybe if you could just explain, could perhaps the government's apathy or attitude towards refusing to implement this basic income grant in the country be also linked to, let's say, these multinational companies looking for countries with much lower
countries' international competitiveness, and taxes are one of the factors investors look at. But what investors worry about more than taxes is profits. And unless a country profitable, they will never think about investing in the first place. When a country has a poverty rate as high as what we heard the World Bank report, we see investors worrying about social cohesion and the fundamentals of human capital and the abilities of households to manage the social risks they face. Those are far more important considerations. Warren Buffett is one of the world's most famous investors and one of the world's most successful. And we hear him constantly exhorting governments to raise their taxes. He's happy to pay the taxes that governments want him to pay, as long as he has the fundamentals that make him profits, and he's able to manage those. He's not afraid of taxes. He wants to find opportunities to increase his profits and returns, to invest in themselves, to invest in their livelihoods, to invest in their communities, to invest in their nation. And that's good for everyone. It's good for people to tackle their own poverty and reap their own rewards because they have the capital, they have a share in their nation's wealth. That does not take profits away from investors. It builds a thriving economy. And that's what all investors want. Domestic investors within Namibia, international investors outside Namibia. They're not going to be afraid of a 2 or 3 percentage point increase in taxes if they see a socially dynamic and economically active Namibia. And that's what a basic income grant can help produce.
I think we're about to round up our press conference. Just one last question or one comment. Anybody? Or should I go ahead? We've been on the basic income grant, or we've been at the forefront of the basic income grant movement in Namibia. And the comments that we've heard so far, many comments that the government is using the basic income grant as a political tool, that it's only, the reason why they are converting basic income grant into food bank because it's mainly, supporters of the ruling SWAPO party that will be benefiting from it. So is that something possible that, governments do use things like that as political tools? Or do you have any comment on that, just to conclude? And then maybe after that you can also make your concluding remarks.
Great. No, that's a really important point, and often observers look at how policymakers make their decisions. And there's a reason we have a democracy. We have a democracy because we want good policies, and politicians will put on the table good policies because they want to be reelected, and there's no problem with that. Basic income grant is not only a popular policy, it is also a good policy. And politicians who adopt good policies should be rewarded with people's votes. To say, oh, this is a populist policy, you're just trying to buy votes. Well, what's the alternative? Government's putting in place bad policies so they don't get elected. No, we tweaking the political deal that democracy offers. Politicians work for their people. They put in place good policies, and those good policies create a strong, prosperous nation, and we love those politicians, and we vote for them, and we keep them in power because we want to continue to see good policies. Let's encourage our political leaders to put on the table good policies like a basic income grant. I'm happy to make those my concluding remarks unless there are more questions. Good policies will eradicate poverty. A basic income grant is one of the most important vital policies for tackling the challenges that COVID-19 have wreaked on this country. A basic income grant will tackle the challenges of that shock and the poverty it has caused. It will give people the resources they need to invest in their own well-being and their own capabilities